Welcome to the channel. Today, we're going back to 1859, to the case of a silent black child who sat at a piano like he'd lived there his whole life and played with a mastery that made grown men go quiet because no one could explain where it came from or what it cost him. This is a difficult and intense story, so take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your support helps keep these stories remembered instead of buried. In the spring of 1859, a boy who almost never spoke was taken onto a stage in the American South and placed in front of a piano under gaslight. He was small for the room, small for the instrument, and small for the moment he was being forced to carry. But when his hands touched the keys, the room changed. Not because the music was loud, because it was exact, because it was controlled, because it arrived the way lightning arrives, not asking permission, not explaining itself, just proving that the air can split. Witnesses would later say the same thing in different words, that it sounded like training, like education, like a life of lessons. And that was the problem. The boy had no lessons, no schooling, no permission to have a mind that belonged to him. He was property. And yet the music came anyway. To understand how a child like that could be made into a spectacle, you have to understand the world that produced him. In 1859, the South was a place built on certainty. Certainty about who mattered. Certainty about who obeyed. Certainty about who could be owned. The land was mapped by fences and ditches, the economy by ledgers, and the future by inheritance. And inside that architecture of certainty, people were bought and sold with the same calm voice used to trade cotton or horses. Children were counted the way livestock was counted. Names were given and taken away depending on who signed the papers. The boy at the center of this story was born into that system, not into a home, exactly, but into a set of hands that could claim him. He was born on a rural property outside a growing southern town, on land that was measured in acres and worked by people who were never meant to leave it. His mother was enslaved. His father may have been enslaved too, or may have been a man whose name never appeared in any record that mattered to the people making the records. Either way, what the boy inherited was not protection, it was exposure. And from the beginning, there was something about him the adults around him struggled to place. He did not speak the way other children did. He did not answer quickly. He did not cry loudly when punished. Sometimes he seemed to be elsewhere, even when he was standing right in front of you. And sometimes his attention was so sharp it felt uncomfortable to be watched by it. People around him described him as odd, as slow, as broken, as touched. Those words were used in the South the way a broom is used to sweep complicated truths into a corner and pretend the floor is clean. But the truth was simpler and more unsettling. The boy's mind was not absent. It was hungry, and it was listening. The first time the boy heard a piano, he was not seated politely in a parlor with clean hands. He was working. He was carrying water. He was moving through a house where he belonged to someone else. Music was not meant for him. Music was something the owners enjoyed after supper, something played by young women in lace, something that drifted down hallways like perfume. But the boy heard it the way a starving person smells bread. He stopped. He listened. He tilted his head, not like a child being entertained, but like a person trying to learn a language before the door closes. Later, when the room emptied, he wandered back to the instrument. Some people said he was drawn to it like sleepwalking. Others said he went because he had been told not to. But the clearest accounts all agree on one thing. The boy touched a key, and then another, and then another. And he did not touch them randomly. He was searching, matching, building, as if the sound lived somewhere in him already, and he was simply finding the shape of it. At first, the adults dismissed it. Enslaved children were expected to work, not to wonder. If a child was quiet, that was considered convenient. If a child was strange, that was considered harmless. But the longer the boy lingered near music, the more the people who owned him began to notice. He would imitate melodies after hearing them once, not approximately, Not close enough. Exactly. The contour, the timing, the pauses, even the mistakes if the original performer had made them. He did it the way a mirror does it, without effort, without explanation, and without any visible awareness that what he was doing should not be possible. That is the moment when the story turns, because in that world, an enslaved child's gift was never allowed to remain a gift. It was immediately converted into value. The man who controlled the property understood value the way he understood weather, not as something to admire, but as something to exploit. He did not see a boy discovering music. He saw an object generating profit. He saw a market. He saw a spectacle that could travel. And he also saw something else, something he did not say out loud. He saw a problem. Because a gift like that created attention, and attention created questions, and questions were dangerous. The solution, in his mind, was to control the narrative before anyone else could touch it, to define the boy publicly as a miracle that belonged to him, to present the child not as a human being with a mind, but as a curiosity with hands. By 1859, rumors had already begun to spread beyond the property. They traveled the way rumors always traveled in the South, carried by people who were not supposed to speak freely, but did anyway when no one was listening. A cook told her cousin. A stable hand told a free black man in town. A seamstress told a church friend. The story changed as it moved, but it kept the same spine. There was a silent boy who could play anything he heard. There was a child who could sit at a piano and make it sound like the world had been rehearsing inside him. White people heard those rumors too. Some laughed, some doubted. Some grew curious in the way a person grows curious about a two-headed calf. And curiosity, in that place and time, always led back to a stage. The stage is where the owners could turn eyes into money and questions into applause. The stage is where they could say, "Look," and then charge you for looking. So a date was chosen. A hall was booked. Notices were printed. Language was carefully selected, the kind of language that promised wonder without granting dignity. The boy was presented as an anomaly, a marvel, a natural, a living trick. And on the day of the performance, he was dressed in clothing meant to make him look smaller, cleaner, and more manageable. He walked into a building full of strangers and placed himself beside an instrument that belonged to a world that would never belong to him. The room filled with men in stiff collars and women in layered dresses, faces bright with expectation and something colder underneath it. People took their seats with the confidence of people who believed they had purchased the right to be entertained. The owner stood in front of them and spoke. He framed the child the way you frame an item for sale. He told the audience what to think before they had a chance to think it themselves. He said the boy could not speak. He said the boy did not understand. He said the boy simply played. And then he introduced the performance as if he were unveiling a machine. The boy was led to the bench. He sat down. For a moment, nothing happened. Just the sound of the room breathing. Just the soft shifting of bodies. Just the faint hiss of gaslight. And then, without ceremony, without warm-up, without the nervous fumbling you would expect from a child, the boy began. The first piece was simple enough to sound familiar to the crowd. A hymn, perhaps, or a popular tune, something safe. Something that allowed the skeptics to lean back and smirk. But within seconds, the smirk faded, because the boy did not play like a child repeating a melody. He played like someone reconstructing a structure. Each phrase landed clean. Each chord was placed with purpose. The tempo held steady in a way that suggested a metronome inside his body. The room quieted. And then the requests began. Someone called out a song. Another man named a march. Someone demanded something complicated, something meant to expose a fraud. The owner smiled, because this was the part that made the money. The boy listened once, just once, and then he played it back. Not only the melody, the harmony, the rhythm, the weight. The character of the piece was as if he had been studying it for years. People stared at each other. People leaned forward. People whispered the same question in different ways. How? And in that question was the seed of everything that came next. Because when people could not explain the music, they stopped thinking about the boy as a person and started thinking about him as a phenomenon. And phenomena, in that world, were owned. This is the beginning of the public story, the part that newspapers would later dress up as charming, the part that audiences would later recall as astonishing over brandy and cigars. But behind that stage, behind that applause, something else was forming. A private story, a locked story, a story written in control and extraction. Because when a child generates wonder, the adults in power immediately start calculating how much of that wonder can be sold before it breaks. And they rarely care what breaks first, the gift, the body, or the person inside the body. After that first performance, the silence around the boy stopped being interpreted as a limitation and began to be used as a feature. It made him easier to frame, easier to narrate, easier to speak over. The owner understood this instinctively. A child who did not answer questions could not contradict the story being told about him. A child who did not speak could be described, however, the teller pleased. So the descriptions hardened quickly. He was called unthinking. He was called animal-like. He was called mechanical. Each word served the same purpose: to explain away the mind behind the music so no one had to confront the possibility that the music came from somewhere human. Performances multiplied. What had been an experiment became a circuit. What had been a room became a route. The boy was moved from hall to hall, town to town, and placed in front of different pianos with different acoustics. And each time the result was the same. He listened once. He played back everything. And when he was not playing back, he was creating, stitching together pieces he had heard into something new, something that carried their bones but not their names. Audiences reacted the way audiences always react when astonishment mixes with entitlement. They leaned closer. They asked for more. They demanded proof. They wanted to see the edges of the trick. They wanted the owner to explain. And the owner explained in a way that kept him safe. He said the boy did not understand what he was doing. He said the boy simply responded to sound. He said there was no thought involved, no intention, no artistry, just imitation. The explanation satisfied those who needed it too. It allowed them to enjoy the performance without discomfort. Because if the boy was not thinking, then no one had to worry about what it meant to force him onto a stage night after night. The schedule tightened. The boy was woken early and kept up late. He was placed in front of instruments until his fingers ached and then placed there again. When he faltered, when his hands slowed, the solution was never rest. It was a correction. Correction came in the form of commands barked into ears he did not respond to, hands placed on shoulders to steer him back to the bench, and eventually punishment. The punishment was quiet at first. Isolation. Removal of food. The withdrawal of the few familiar comforts he had been allowed. Later, it escalated. Because when a gift makes money, patience becomes expensive. People who paid to see him wanted certainty. They wanted consistency. They wanted the boy to perform on demand, regardless of hunger, fatigue, or fear. And the owner promised them that certainty. The boy's inner life during this period is something no record fully captures. There are no diaries, no letters, no confessions. What survives are observations. He rarely resisted physically. He did not cry when struck. He did not plead when corrected. Instead, he withdrew further inward. His eyes tracked everything. His body obeyed. His hands continued to deliver what was asked of them. Those who watched him closely noticed that he flinched at sudden noises, but not at shouted orders. That he could be startled by a dropped object, but remained unmoved by threats. That he calmed only when sound returned to the structure, when music replaced chaos. On stage, his posture changed. His shoulders settled. His breathing slowed. Whatever storm existed inside him organized itself around the keys. The piano became the only place where the world followed rules that made sense. Outside the performances, his days were managed by others. He was moved through spaces that were not his. He slept where he was told. He ate when allowed. He was exhibited to visitors who were invited to observe him like a specimen. They tested him. They clapped unexpectedly to see if he would react. They played wrong notes on purpose to see if he would correct them. They spoke loudly about him as if he were not present. He absorbed all of it, every sound, every cadence, every careless remark. His silence made people bold. They said things in front of him they would never have said to someone they believed could understand. They spoke about money. They spoke about ownership. They spoke about how long the novelty might last. They speculated about whether his ability would fade with age. And somewhere in the middle of all that talk, a new idea began to take shape in the minds of the people who controlled him. If imitation could be monetized, then memory could be monetized too. They began to test how much the boy could retain. They played long pieces once and asked him to reproduce them days later. He did. They asked him to play with variations. He did. They played multiple pieces back to back and asked him to recall them in reverse order. He did. Each success tightened the grip around him, because now the boy was not just an attraction, he was an archive, a living storage of sound, something that could not be replaced. Something that had to be guarded, and guarding in that context meant confinement. His movements became more restricted. He was kept away from other children. He was kept away from spaces where music might be played without supervision. The fear was not that he would forget. The fear was that he would learn something the owners did not control. The irony, of course, was that learning was already happening constantly, not through instruction, but through exposure. He learned how adults lied. He learned how applause could coexist with cruelty. He learned how language could be used to shrink a person while pretending to praise them. And he learned that silence could be mistaken for absence. The press began to take notice. Short notices appeared, marveling at the phenomenon, repeating the owner's framing without challenge. The boy was described as natural, as untrained, and as instinctive. The words reassured readers that no boundaries had been crossed, that nothing about the world needed to change to accommodate what they were seeing. The performances grew larger. The venues grew grander. And with each step up the ladder, the boy became further removed from any place where he could be treated as a child. He was dressed, presented, moved, and timed. He was introduced with speeches that told audiences how to feel. He was applauded like a man and punished like a thing. And still, the music did not falter. In fact, it deepened. Witnesses began to notice that his playing carried something heavier than imitation, that there was emotion in it, but not the kind that reached for the audience. It was inward, private, as if the music was not meant to be shared at all, but was leaking out anyway. Some listeners were unsettled by this. They could not name why. They just knew that watching him made them uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with novelty. A few began to ask questions that the owner did not like. Was the boy ever allowed to rest? Did he choose what he played? Did he understand the applause? Those questions were brushed aside. The narrative was adjusted. The boy was said to enjoy performing. He was said to crave the piano. He was said to be happiest when working. These claims were repeated often enough to sound like truth. And repetition, in that world, was authority. But there were moments when the performance cracked, when the boy refused to begin immediately, when he sat still with his hands in his lap while the room waited. Those pauses terrified the people who depended on him. They could not force the music out of him with threats alone. They needed his cooperation, and so they began to experiment with incentives: food, warmth, small comforts. The lesson was simple. Compliance brought relief. Resistance brought pain. Over time, the boy learned the pattern well enough to anticipate it. He learned how to deliver exactly what was required while holding everything else back. That balance would become his survival, because the world he was trapped in did not need him to be whole. It only needed his hands. By the time the boy's name began circulating beyond local papers, the performances had shifted from novelty to fixation. People no longer came simply to be impressed. They came to be convinced, to see for themselves whether the rumors were exaggerated, whether the silence concealed some hidden trick, and whether the music could really arrive whole without effort or instruction. The owner encouraged this shift. Doubt, after all, sold tickets. Each skeptical audience member was a potential witness converted, another voice to carry the story farther than any advertisement could reach. And so the demonstrations became more elaborate. The boy was asked not only to reproduce what he heard, but also to do it under conditions designed to humiliate him if he failed. Blindfolds were added, as if blindness itself were not already part of his life. Chairs were moved, instruments were swapped. Someone would strike random keys with both hands and challenge him to repeat the chaos exactly. He did. Someone else would hum a melody incorrectly and ask him to play it as sung, flaws included. He did. The audience gasped each time, not just at the accuracy, but at the implication that something inside the boy was operating beyond ordinary reach. And with that implication came a new danger. Because in a society built on hierarchy, unexplained excellence in the wrong body always provoked fear. Some spectators began to whisper that the music was unnatural. Others framed it as divine. A few spoke the word curse. The owner responded by tightening control even further. He could not allow the narrative to slip out of his hands. So he leaned harder into the explanation that stripped the boy of agency. He emphasized instinct. He emphasized mimicry. He emphasized the absence of speech as proof of the absence of thought. The boy, meanwhile, continued to absorb everything. Sound was not the only thing he remembered. He remembered faces. He remembered who clapped hardest and who watched with narrowed eyes. He remembered which voices carried kindness and which carried threat. He remembered the rhythm of travel, the way towns blurred together, and the way hotel rooms all smelled faintly of dust and oil. He remembered the routes, the schedules, the patterns. And he remembered, perhaps most sharply, the moments just before a performance began, when the room was full but silent, when everyone else seemed to be holding their breath. Those moments belonged to him. They were the only times when nothing was demanded yet, when expectation hovered without touching. As the boy grew, his body changed in ways the owner could not entirely control. His hands grew larger. His reach extended. His playing gained weight. Some listeners began to comment that the music sounded older and heavier, as if it carried experience that the boy himself did not have permission to acquire. This unsettled the people who preferred to believe the story of the mindless prodigy, because weight suggested intention, and intention suggested will. The owner adjusted again. New explanations were offered. The boy was said to have no sense of time. He was said to live entirely in the moment of sound. He was said to forget performances as soon as they ended. None of this was true. But truth was not the currency of the circuit. Control was. Away from the stage, the boy's world narrowed. He was not taught to read, not formally. Literacy would have given him access to things that could not be easily monitored. Instead, he learned through listening. He learned the way enslaved people had always learned when denied instruction, by collecting fragments, by piecing together knowledge from what leaked through walls and conversations. He learned the language of money without ever holding it. He learned the language of contracts without ever signing one. He learned the language of praise without believing it. At some point, someone noticed that the boy could reproduce not just music but speech patterns, accents, cadences, the way different men pronounced the same words. This discovery delighted the owner. It was added to the show. The boy was prompted to imitate voices from the audience, to mimic the way someone spoke, sometimes to laughter, sometimes to discomfort. The laughter did not bother him. The discomfort interested him. It was another signal, another indication of where power lay and how easily it could be unsettled by reflection. The performances continued through seasons that shifted without notice. Summers, where the air was thick and bodies wilted. Winters, where the cold crept into joints and made fingers stiff. The boy played through all of it. He played when sick. He played when exhausted. He played when the piano keys were chipped and uneven. Each performance fed the legend and hollowed him further. There were occasional attempts by outsiders to intervene. A teacher once asked if the boy had ever been instructed. The owner laughed and said instruction would ruin the purity of the gift. A preacher suggested the boy be allowed rest. The owner reminded him who paid for the church's roof. Questions dissolved into silence. Silence was always safer. But silence, in this case, was also accumulating. Inside the boy, something began to shift. Not rebellion in the dramatic sense, not escape. He did not run, he did not refuse, he did not collapse. Instead, he began to conserve, to separate what he delivered from what he retained. On stage, he gave them precision. Off stage, he withdrew further. He began to rock slightly when overstimulated, a movement that soothed him and brought order back into his body. Those who watched him misinterpreted this as emptiness, as absence. They were wrong. It was containment. The owner's ambitions grew with the boy's reputation. There was talk of traveling farther, of reaching larger cities, of introducing the boy to audiences who would pay more for astonishment. Each new possibility was framed as an opportunity. None were framed as risk, because risk, in that world, was something borne by the owned, not the owner. The boy was prepared for these expansions without consultation. His schedule was adjusted. His performances lengthened. He was pushed to demonstrate endurance as well as brilliance. Audiences were encouraged to test him, to stretch the performance until it became an ordeal. And still, he delivered, which only encouraged them to ask for more. At some point, a physician was brought in, not to care for him, to examine him, to determine how his mind worked. The examination was intrusive and misguided. The conclusions were vague and self-serving. The physician declared the boy incapable of higher reasoning, declared his abilities reflexive, declared that no harm could be done because there was no awareness to be harmed. The report reassured those who wanted reassurance, and it silenced those who felt uneasy but lacked authority. The boy did not understand the language of the report, but he understood the tone. He understood that he had been measured and found convenient. He understood that the adults around him were relieved. Relief, he would learn, was often the prelude to cruelty. As the country edged closer to rupture, as political tensions thickened the air, the boy remained a constant, a traveling certainty, something people could point to and say, "See, the world still makes sense. See, wonder exists without consequence." They did not see the cost accumulating in small ways, in the boy's posture, in his sleep, in the way his hands sometimes trembled before finding the keys. When the fracture finally came, it did not announce itself to the boy as history. It arrived as a disruption. Roots changed, faces disappeared, voices grew sharper. The tone of conversations shifted even when the words stayed polite. The owner became more vigilant, more possessive, as if sensing that forces beyond his control were beginning to move. The performances did not stop. If anything, they intensified. Music became reassurance. Crowds gathered not just to be amazed, but to feel anchored to something familiar while everything else felt uncertain. The boy was placed at the center of that need. He was presented as proof that order still existed, that hierarchies remained intact, and that brilliance could still be contained and displayed without consequence. The irony was invisible to those who benefited from it. As conflict spread and the country hardened into opposing sides, the boy's movements became more calculated. He was brought before audiences who were no longer just curious but anxious. Men in uniform attended performances. Their reactions were louder and more performative. Applause came faster. Challenges were more aggressive. The owner encouraged this. He reframed the boy's music as emblematic, as something that belonged not to the boy himself, but to the cause of those listening. Certain pieces were requested again and again, martial rhythms, familiar melodies associated with pride and victory. The boy played them because that was what he was trained to do. But something subtle changed in the way he played. The tempos stretched. Certain notes lingered longer than expected. Harmonies darkened. Most listeners did not notice. Those who did could not explain what unsettled them. They dismissed it as imagination, or fatigue, or the acoustics of unfamiliar halls. The owner did not hear it at all. He heard only success. He heard only money. He heard only the reinforcement of his belief that the boy was a vessel, not a voice. Offstage, conditions deteriorated. Travel became harsher. Lodgings became less predictable. Food was inconsistent. The boy's routines were disrupted repeatedly, sometimes daily. For someone whose mind relied on pattern and predictability, this was not a small thing. It manifested in increased withdrawal, in longer periods of silence, in moments where his hands hovered over the keys before committing. Observers interpreted these pauses as drama, as tension, as part of the show. They applauded when he resumed, unaware that the hesitation was not theatrical but physiological, his body recalibrating under strain. During this period, the boy began composing more frequently, not for the stage, for himself. These compositions were not written down. They lived only in his hands and memory. Those who overheard them described them as strange, less structured, more volatile. They rose suddenly and collapsed without warning. They sounded like storms breaking apart and reforming. The owner discouraged this. Improvisation was unpredictable. It could not be marketed easily. It could not be explained away as mimicry. Still, the boy returned to it whenever he could, late at night, in empty rooms, when the only audience was the walls. As the war deepened, the boy's value increased. He was taken to new locations, sometimes close to the edges of violence. He played for audiences whose faces carried exhaustion and fear. He played for men who would leave the hall and never return. The music took on a different function in these spaces. It was no longer entertainment. It was a ritual. It was a way to remember who they believed themselves to be. And the boy, who could not speak, who was never asked what he believed, became the instrument of that remembering. The owner spoke often during these performances. He framed the boy's existence as evidence, evidence of benevolence, evidence of natural order, evidence that those in control deserved to remain so. Each speech drew applause. Each speech tightened the boy's confinement. There were moments when the boy resisted in the only way available to him. He would play a requested piece, but alter it slightly. A shift in harmony. A discordant turn where none was expected. Most listeners lacked the musical knowledge to articulate what felt wrong. They simply felt it, a flicker of unease. A sensation that something beneath the surface was not aligned with the narrative they were being sold. The owner dismissed complaints. He blamed instruments, acoustics, the boy's condition. Anything but intention. Because intention would have required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would have unraveled everything. When the war finally ended, the country was changed in ways no performance could smooth over. Laws shifted. Words like freedom were spoken aloud in places where they had once been unthinkable. For many, this marked an ending. For the boy, it marked a transformation without release. His legal status changed on paper. His lived reality did not. The owner moved quickly. Paperwork replaced chains. New arguments replaced old justifications. The boy was no longer described as owned, but as incapable, not enslaved, but protected. The same control remained, dressed in different language. The boy was older now. His body bore the marks of years spent performing without rest. His mind carried an archive no one else could access. He had memorized cities, crowds, reactions. He had memorized the sound of applause in different rooms, the way it echoed differently depending on who was clapping and why. And he had learned something else during the war years. He had learned that music could say more than words precisely because words could be policed. Music could pass unnoticed. It could be praised for the wrong reasons. It could carry meaning beneath approval. This knowledge did not free him, but it fortified him. The transition was quiet, which made it effective. There were no dramatic confrontations, no declarations, and no moment where the boy was told that his life would remain the same under a different name. Instead, there were documents, signatures, conversations held just out of his hearing. The world congratulated itself on progress while ensuring continuity. The owner positioned himself not as a master, but as a guardian. The boy was described as dependent, incapable of managing his own affairs, and unfit for autonomy. This framing was persuasive to those who wanted reassurance that order had survived upheaval. It allowed admiration without responsibility, applause without accountability. The boy was no longer presented as property, but as an exception, a singular marvel requiring oversight. And so the performances continued, now marketed as benevolent exhibitions rather than coercive displays. Audiences were told they were witnessing care, not control. The boy's silence became part of the justification. He did not object, he did not contradict, he did not demand it. This absence of protest was interpreted as consent. No one asked whether consent required language. The schedules returned, though altered. Fewer large halls, more private salons. The crowds were smaller but more exclusive. Wealth concentrated the spectacle. The boy was placed in rooms where conversations before and after his playing carried more weight than applause ever had. He played while deals were made, while reputations were cemented, while narratives about progress were rehearsed aloud. His presence lent legitimacy to claims that the past had been resolved, that brilliance could thrive without chains, that no injustice lingered beneath the surface. The boy's role was no longer simply to perform but to reassure. He learned this not through explanation but through pattern. The pieces requested now emphasized refinement over power, precision over ferocity. The owner encouraged this shift. He spoke often of restraint, of discipline, of channeling raw ability into something respectable. The boy complied, but the music carried undercurrents that did not match the rhetoric. His interpretations grew more layered. Themes folded into each other. Moments of beauty gave way to abrupt dissonance, then returned as if nothing had happened. Listeners described the experience as unsettling but moving. They praised the complexity without recognizing its origin. The boy was not expressing gratitude. He was mapping contradiction. Physically, the years were taking their toll. The strain of constant performance, of repetition without rest, of travel without recovery, manifested in visible ways. His posture changed. His movements slowed. His hands, once tireless, began to tremble between sessions. The owner dismissed concerns. Fatigue was framed as temperament, pain as eccentricity. Any suggestion that the boy needed rest was met with assurances that he was happiest at the piano. This was repeated often enough that others began to believe it, including at times the boy himself. Identity, when imposed long enough, can feel indistinguishable from truth. But there were moments when the illusion fractured. They came unexpectedly. A missed note, a delayed entrance, a sudden cessation of sound. In these pauses, the room held its breath. Listeners felt something approaching discomfort. The owner intervened quickly, filling the silence with explanation. He spoke for the boy. He always had. The music resumed. Applause followed. The rupture was sealed. Behind closed doors, tensions escalated. The boy's increasing withdrawal worried those responsible for maintaining appearances. New strategies were discussed. Adjustments proposed. There was talk of limiting his repertoire, of simplifying demands, of controlling the conditions more tightly, not for his benefit, but for predictability. The boy became an asset to be managed rather than a person to be considered. The language used to describe him reflected this shift. He was referred to in terms of output, reliability, longevity. The same metrics applied to machinery. Still, the boy learned. Always. He learned how people responded to certain progressions, which harmonies elicited unease, which silences provoked impatience. He learned how to guide an audience's emotions without their awareness. This was not taught. It was discovered, through repetition, through observation, through survival. His silence, once perceived as absence, became his shield. People projected onto it whatever they needed: genius, innocence, simplicity. They never considered that silence could also be a strategy. As years passed, new figures entered the boy's life, individuals who saw him less as a curiosity and more as a resource. They spoke of education, of training, of refinement beyond performance. Some suggested that his abilities warranted broader recognition. Academic interest grew, studies were proposed, articles drafted. The boy became the subject of analysis. His mind was dissected in theory, while his autonomy remained untouched in practice. Observers debated the origins of his talent: nature, instinct, divine intervention, anything that avoided confronting the environment that had shaped him, anything that absolved those who benefited from his containment. The boy listened, always listening. He absorbed the language used around him, even if he could not replicate it aloud. He understood how narratives were constructed, how emphasis could redirect blame, how omission could erase responsibility. This understanding did not liberate him, but it sharpened his awareness of the system enclosing him. Music remained his only means of response, and he refined it accordingly. Pieces grew more intricate. Structures are more deceptive. What sounded like compliance carried undercurrents of dissent. What sounded like mastery carried echoes of captivity. Few recognized this. Those who did rarely spoke, and those who spoke were ignored. Because acknowledging the boy's interiority would have required a reckoning with the mechanisms that sustained his exploitation. It was easier to call it a mystery, easier to marvel than to intervene. By the time the boy reached adulthood, his identity had been fixed in the public imagination. He was frozen in time, perpetually childlike, regardless of his age. This perception was convenient. It justified continued control. It allowed admiration without equality. His growth was physical and undeniable. But his autonomy remained arrested. The world accepted this contradiction without question. By the time the boy was no longer young, the world had already decided who he was allowed to be. That decision hardened into routine. He was introduced the same way everywhere, his age spoken of vaguely, his history condensed into a few safe phrases that avoided discomfort. The longer version of his life existed only in fragments carried by those who had traveled with him, and even they learned to shorten it. Audiences preferred marvel to memory. They wanted the performance without the cost. The boy's body reflected the passage of years more honestly than any announcement ever did. His shoulders sloped from long hours at the instrument. His gait slowed. His hands, once astonishing for their endurance, now required careful warming before they could perform. None of this altered expectations. If anything, it increased them. Survival itself became part of the spectacle. Each appearance was framed as a triumph over limitation, as proof that whatever confined him was also sustaining him. The logic was circular and effective. He continued to play. He continued to deliver what was asked of him. Therefore, the system must be working. The idea that endurance could coexist with harm was not entertained. When questions arose, they were absorbed into the mythology. The boy was described as other, not subject to ordinary needs, not governed by the same rules as everyone else. This separation allowed admiration to coexist with neglect. The owner, now older, leaned heavily on this narrative. He spoke publicly about sacrifice and care, about the burden of responsibility. Privately, he tightened control. Appearances were coordinated. Access was restricted. The boy's movements were monitored more closely than ever. He was rarely alone. And when he was, it was only briefly, long enough to ensure that nothing unpredictable could occur. The boy adapted. Adaptation had always been his primary skill. He adjusted his posture to minimize pain. He adjusted his breathing to manage fatigue. He adjusted his playing to account for stiffness and tremor. These adjustments were subtle, invisible to most, but they changed the music. The pieces slowed. Spaces opened between phrases. Silences became more deliberate. The boy began to rely less on speed and more on structure, less on force and more on control. The effect was profound. Audiences described the performances as deeper and more mature. They praised evolution without understanding its cause. They spoke of growth as if it were freely chosen. Meanwhile, interest in the boy intensified in academic circles. Scholars requested demonstrations. Physicians proposed examinations. The language used was clinical, detached, and ostensibly objective. His abilities were cataloged. His responses were measured. His silence was interpreted through frameworks that denied him agency, even as they sought to explain it. The boy was present for these discussions, seated nearby, listening. He learned how easily curiosity could become entitlement, how observation could become intrusion, how analysis could erase personhood under the guise of understanding. He responded in the only way he could. When asked to perform during these sessions, he played differently, not definitely, not dramatically. He introduced irregularities, patterns that refused neat classification, variations that undermined the theories being proposed. The scholars took notes. They debated. They failed to reach consensus. The boy watched them struggle to impose order on something that had been shaped by disorder from the beginning. Outside these rooms, public performances continued. The boy's reputation grew. He was spoken of in distant cities by people who had never seen him. Stories circulated, embellishments accumulated. He became less a person and more a concept. The reality of his confinement blurred beneath layers of admiration. Those who questioned the arrangement were reassured. He was well cared for. He was content. He had no interest in independence. These statements were repeated often enough to become accepted truth. No evidence was required. The boy did not contradict them. His silence was convenient. But silence does not imply absence of thought. Over time, the boy developed a relationship with the instrument that transcended performance. It became an archive. Each piece carried memory. Each variation marked a moment. The music tracked what history refused to record. Pain transformed into structure. Constraint into form. What could not be spoken was preserved in sound. Those who listened closely felt this. They could not name it, but they felt weight beneath the beauty, a tension that did not resolve. Some described it as sorrow, others as depth. Few recognized it as testimony. The owner grew increasingly defensive as the boy aged. Questions about succession arose. What would happen when the boy could no longer perform? Who would manage? What remained? These concerns were discussed openly, often in the boy's presence, as if he were a future event rather than a living person. Plans were drafted, arrangements made. The boy absorbed all of it. He understood that his value, as defined by others, was finite, that once his output declined, so would their interest. This knowledge did not embitter him. It clarified him. He focused more intensely on what remained within his control. The music, the patterns, the memory encoded in sound. He played less often, but with greater intention. Each performance felt weighted and deliberate, as if aware of its place in a diminishing sequence. Audiences sensed this and responded with heightened emotion. They applauded longer. They praised louder. The boy acknowledged none of it. Applause had never been the point. Preservation was. By the time decline became undeniable, it was already being managed. The language around it softened the reality without changing its consequences. The boy was described as delicate now, sensitive, fragile. These words replaced earlier ones like extraordinary and miraculous, but they served the same purpose. They excused the restriction. They justified surveillance. They allowed others to speak on his behalf without challenge. Performances were spaced farther apart, framed as preservation rather than limitation. Each appearance was treated as an event, a rare opportunity to witness something fading. Audiences leaned forward not just in anticipation but in fear. They sensed an ending approaching even if they could not articulate what exactly was ending. The boy felt it too, though in a different way. For him, the ending was not about ability, but about time. The body's signals grew louder. Recovery took longer. Pain lingered instead of passing. Still, he played when asked. He always did, but the music had changed again. It was quieter now. Not weaker, but more contained. The spaces between notes expanded. Silences stretched longer than audiences expected, long enough to make some uncomfortable. These pauses were not mistakes. They were deliberate. They forced listeners to confront the absence as much as the sound, to sit with what was missing. Some found this unbearable. Others found it profound. The owner was uneasy. Silence was unpredictable. It could not be directed. It invited interpretation. He urged the boy to maintain energy, to keep the performances uplifting. The boy complied on the surface, but the undercurrents remained. He had learned how to give people what they asked for, while withholding what they did not deserve. This was not defiance. It was discernment. In private, conversations grew more urgent. Advisors discussed legacy, how the boy would be remembered, what narratives should endure. They spoke of recordings, of documentation, of preserving the phenomenon. The boy was included in these discussions only as a subject, never as an author. Decisions were made around him, not with him. Yet he listened, as he always had. He understood that memory could be shaped long before death, that omission could be as powerful as invention. This understanding guided his remaining performances. He treated each one as a record, not of brilliance but of circumstance. He embedded reminders in the music, not obvious ones. Subtle deviations, harmonic tensions that refused resolution, structures that circled without closing. These choices frustrated some listeners. Critics struggled to categorize the later work. They called it uneven, inconsistent, too complex. Others defended it as evolution, maturity, depth. The boy did not concern himself with these debates. He was not trying to be understood. He was trying to be honest. As access tightened further, fewer people saw him play. Those who did often left unsettled. They spoke of a heaviness in the room, of the sense that they had witnessed something intimate they were not meant to fully grasp. The owner interpreted this as reverence. He encouraged it. He believed awe was controlled by another name. He did not recognize that the awe now belonged to something beyond his reach. The boy's relationship to the instrument deepened. It became less a tool and more a companion. He spent long stretches with it, not performing, not practicing, simply listening, feeling the vibration of keys beneath his fingers, recalling earlier versions of himself through sound. Memory layered upon memory. The instrument held his life in a way no archive ever could. When performances became impossible to avoid canceling, the explanations grew elaborate. Health, exhaustion, the need for rest. These were offered publicly, while privately the pressure remained. The boy was urged to push through discomfort one last time, to give audiences closure, to complete the story. He understood what was being asked, and he refused in the only way available. He played fewer pieces, shorter ones. He ended abruptly, without flourish, without release. Audiences waited for more. It did not come. Applause filled the space, instead. The boy did not respond. This withholding unsettled many. They wanted resolution. They wanted gratitude. They wanted acknowledgement. The boy offered none. He had spent his life providing what others demanded. This final restraint was not rebellion. It was a reclamation. The owner interpreted it as a decline, as a loss, as something to be managed. But the boy knew otherwise. He was choosing what remained. When the final public performance occurred, it passed without ceremony. No announcement marked it as such. No declarations were made. Those present sensed its weight only afterward. The music was restrained, focused. It circled familiar themes without resolving them. It ended not with a flourish, but with a pause that stretched long enough to feel intentional. The boy lifted his hands from the keys and did not return them. Applause followed, uncertain at first, then louder. The boy did not bow. He did not acknowledge the sound. He simply stood and left the room. For those who understood, that was the point. The silence that followed did not bring rest. It brought reorganization. Once the performances stopped, attention shifted immediately to management. Schedules were replaced with statements. Absence was framed as transition. The boy was spoken of as though he were no longer present, even while he remained physically there. Decisions accelerated. Custodianship tightened. The same voices that had once arranged tours now arranged seclusion. Access became a privilege granted sparingly. Visitors were filtered. Correspondence was screened. The boy's world narrowed to a small number of rooms, familiar faces, and an instrument that now sat mostly untouched. This withdrawal was presented as care. The language was gentle, protective. It concealed the reality that control had simply found a quieter form. The boy adapted again. He always had. Without the demand to perform, his days stretched differently. Time lost its external markers. There were no cues to prepare, no applause to anticipate. Instead, there was observation, listening, remembering. The boy spent hours revisiting pieces internally, replaying them without sound. His mind remained active, intricate, and alert. The world assumed stillness meant emptiness. It did not. It meant containment. Discussions about legacy intensified. People who had never asked for his consent now debated how best to preserve his story. They proposed exhibitions, publications, retrospectives. His life was reduced to elements that could be arranged, displayed, and interpreted without complication. The boy's silence made this easy. He did not interrupt. He did not correct. He did not offer alternative versions. Those closest to him spoke instead, filling gaps with speculation and reassurance. They emphasized benevolence. They minimized harm. They highlighted achievement while omitting cost. The boy listened. He understood that narratives do not need accuracy to endure. They need repetition. In private moments, the boy returned to the instrument, not to perform, but to trace. He placed his hands on the keys without pressing them. He felt the familiar geometry beneath his fingers. This contact was enough. Sound was no longer required. The music existed within him, fully formed, needing no audience. These moments were rarely witnessed. When they were misunderstood. Observers described them as a habit, as a compulsion, as evidence of limitation. They did not consider the possibility that restraint could be intentional, that withholding sound might be a choice. The owner's presence diminished. Age and obligation drew him elsewhere. Others took over daily management. They were efficient, impersonal. They treated the boy as something to be preserved rather than engaged. He was encouraged to rest, to remain quiet, to accept the shape his life had taken. He did. Outwardly. Inwardly, he remained alert. He tracked conversations. He recognized patterns in how people spoke about him when they thought he could not understand. He heard how the narrative hardened, how the complexities of his life were smoothed into something palatable. Genius without context, silence without cause, brilliance without resistance. This was the version that would survive, if unchallenged. The boy could not speak to correct it. He could not write to contest it. But he understood that memory was not only external. It lived in those who had heard him play. In the unease some still carried. In the unresolved tension his music had left behind. That was not easily erased. As years passed, references to the boy shifted from present to past tense even before his life ended. He became an idea while still breathing. People spoke of what he had been, not what he was. This erasure was subtle and complete. When illness eventually arrived, it was treated as an inevitability, another confirmation of fragility. another justification for exclusion. The boy endured it with the same restraint he had practiced all his life. Pain was managed, comfort provided selectively. Decisions made without his input. He did not resist. Resistance had never been his method. Preservation was. In the final stretch, visitors arrived who wanted proximity to history. They sat quietly, watching, waiting for something extraordinary to occur. It did not. The boy remained still, observant, silent. They left disappointed, unaware that what they sought had already been given years before, embedded in sound they had failed to truly hear. When the end came, it was unremarkable. No performance marked it. No final display. The world learned of it afterward, through announcements crafted to maintain the established narrative. Tributes followed. They emphasized wonder. They avoided reckoning. The boy was praised for what he had given, not for what had been taken. His silence was recast as a mystery one last time. But silence does not disappear with death. It lingers. It presses. It asks questions long after the voice that carried it is gone. What followed was not forgetting, but arrangement. Memory did not fade on its own. It was organized, selected, edited. The story that emerged after the boy's death was clean in ways his life had never been. It moved smoothly from wonder to legacy without lingering on friction. Publications praised his abilities. Speakers recounted his feats. Institutions positioned him as proof of progress, as evidence that brilliance could emerge even under constraint. The phrasing was careful. Even when suffering was acknowledged, it was abstracted. Difficulty became an obstacle. Control became guidance. Silence became innocence. The boy's interior life remained absent from the record, not because it was unknowable, but because acknowledging it would have disrupted the narrative that so many had invested in maintaining. Objects associated with him gained value. The instrument, the rooms he had occupied, items that had once been ordinary became artifacts. They were preserved behind glass, contextualized with plaques that spoke confidently about meaning without ever inviting doubt. Visitors stood before these displays and felt reverence. They felt connected to something extraordinary. Few asked what it had cost. Fewer still noticed what was missing. The story they encountered was complete enough to discourage questions. Meanwhile, those who had known the boy personally remembered him differently. Their memories were quieter, less orderly. They spoke of long pauses, of moments when his attention drifted inward, of music that left them unsettled long after it ended. These recollections circulated privately. They did not enter official accounts. They were dismissed as subjective, as anecdotal, as incompatible with the polished version that institutions preferred. Over time, the public memory hardened. The boy became emblematic, a symbol rather than a person. His silence was celebrated as purity. His obedience was reframed as devotion. His endurance recast as joy. Each retelling smoothed another edge. Each repetition pushed the truth further beneath the surface. Yet the music resisted this flattening. Recordings, where they existed, carried traces that words could not neutralize. Listeners who approached them without expectation sometimes felt an unease they could not explain. Certain passages refused resolution. Certain pauses lingered too long. The structure suggested intention beyond technique. Scholars debated these elements endlessly, proposing theories that circled around the obvious without naming it. They spoke of instinct, of anomaly, of mystery, anything but context, anything but power. The boy's silence continued to protect him in death. It prevented others from easily claiming his voice, but it also left space. Space for interpretation. Space for those willing to listen differently. Over generations, small shifts occurred. New questions surfaced, not loudly, not all at once, but persistently. Why had he never been allowed autonomy? Why had decisions always been made for him? Why had his silence been treated as absence rather than presence? These questions did not immediately change the dominant narrative, but they complicated it. They introduced instability. And instability made room for truth. The boy's life, once reduced to spectacle, began to be reconsidered as testimony. Not because he spoke, but because the patterns of control were too consistent to ignore. The arrangements are too deliberate. The omissions are too telling. What had once been framed as benevolence began to look like confinement by another name. What had been praised as care revealed its limits. The silence that had been romanticized began to read as constraint. This reevaluation was slow. Resistance was strong. Many preferred the original story. It was comforting. It required nothing of them. But comfort is fragile. It cracks under sustained attention. And attention was returning. The reckoning did not arrive as a revelation. There was no single moment when the story flipped and the truth announced itself. Instead, understanding accumulated the way sediment does, slowly, unevenly, reshaping the landscape over time. Each reconsideration added weight. Each unanswered question pressed harder. What finally emerged was not a corrected version of the boy's life, but a deeper one, layered and unresolved. The silence that had once been framed as mystery now demanded attention, not because it hid something unknowable, but because it revealed a system that had depended on quiet compliance. The boy's life, when examined without the protective gloss of admiration, traced a consistent pattern. Control justified as care. Restriction reframed as protection. Absence of consent is treated as neutrality. None of these mechanisms were unique. That was the most unsettling realization. They were familiar, reproducible, still present in other forms. The boy had not been an anomaly. He had been an example. This recognition shifted how the music was heard. What once sounded like brilliance detached from context began to register as something else entirely. Testimony. Resistance expressed without confrontation. Memory preserved without permission. The unresolved tensions in the compositions were no longer treated as stylistic quirks. They were understood as deliberate, as records of constraint. The pauses were no longer empty. They were spaces where something had been withheld, not because it could not be given, but because it was not safe to do so. The boy's silence, long romanticized, emerged as the most honest part of his legacy. It had protected him when speech would have been punished. It had prevented others from fully claiming his interior life. It had allowed the music to carry meaning beyond the reach of those who sought to control its narrative. In this way, silence was not absence. It was a boundary. The institutions that had once celebrated him adjusted their language as the reassessment deepened. New exhibits included context previously omitted. New essays acknowledged constraint alongside talent. These changes were incremental and cautious. They stopped short of full accountability, but they mattered. They signaled that the story could no longer remain sealed. That admiration alone was insufficient. That brilliance, extracted under control, demanded reckoning, not applause. The boy's life began to be taught differently, not as an inspirational exception, but as a case study in how systems absorb and neutralize extraordinary ability when it threatens to expose imbalance. His silence was no longer treated as evidence of simplicity, but as a reminder of how often voices are denied while still being heard in other ways. The music endured. It outlived the conditions that shaped it. New listeners approached it without the expectations that had once governed reception. Some still felt uneasy, others felt clarity. The sound did not soften with time. It remained unresolved. It refused closure. And that refusal was its final statement. The boy had never been allowed to define his own ending. The music corrected that. It left space. It declined resolution. It insisted on complexity. In doing so, it returned agency where none had been granted in life. The story, when finally allowed to breathe, did not resolve into triumph or tragedy. It settled into something harder to accept: responsibility. It asked listeners not to marvel but to notice, not to celebrate, but to consider what brilliance looks like when shaped by power rather than freedom. The boy did not leave instructions. He did not need to. The record was already there, embedded in sound and silence alike. What remained was choice, whether to keep the story comfortable or to let it remain difficult, whether to admire from a distance or to listen closely enough to hear what had always been present beneath the music.